This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahon, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 566th MTG Top 10. Today I'm going to give you my picks for Magic's worst sorceries. This is a list I've done before, but it's been a really long time. The original Top 10 on worst sorceries came out on December 23rd of 2016, and what was only the 34th episode of this series. That means it came out more than 6 years ago and more than 500 episodes ago. And that list is not my best work. And not just because of the woeful sound and visuals. The actual substance of the list isn't good either. In the early days of MTG Top 10s, I hadn't really figured out what kind of criteria I wanted to use for worst lists, and the biggest problem is that I didn't take Commander into account. Obviously, that's a huge issue. A card simply can't be considered one of the worst cards ever if it's widely played in Commander. The other big problem with that list is I somehow put One With Nothing at number 1. Don't get me wrong, I think One With Nothing is awful, as I've discussed in other worst videos, but the problem with One With Nothing at number 1 is that it's not a sorcery. This is probably the biggest mistake I've ever made in a video, and I'm not sure how that made it through, but these were the earliest days of the channel. So the point is, the way I do things now, and with the removal of One With Nothing, this list looks quite a bit different. This time around, I think the video will be a much better representation of the worst sorceries in Magic. I'm going to treat this kind of like retaking a class you failed and hope I can just replace that failed video with a much more successful attempt. As usual, for a card to appear on a worst list, the card has to be bad in 60 card constructed formats, it has to be bad in EDH, and it has to be bad in limited. While the order of the list and the cards that appear on it are left to my opinion, I do use data from those various formats to help me make my selections. In all, Magic has 2,859 sorceries, and in this video I'll give my picks for the 10 worst ones ever printed. At number 10, I have a collection of cards that hose really narrow mechanics. These are by no means the entirety of cards in this category. There are lots of them out there, but these are the ones that I think are the worst of the worst. Tripwire kills creatures with horsemanship, Tombfire hates on flashback, and Trapfinder's Trick hates on traps. Tripwire is probably the best at actually hating the thing it hates on because at least it's a good removal spell against creatures with horsemanship, but it suffers from the fact that there are very few creatures with horsemanship and virtually none that see play anywhere. So it might hate on the mechanic the best, but it's even more narrow than the others. Tombfire exiles all cards with flashback from a graveyard, and yeah, flashback is a pretty common mechanic, but the silly thing is there are lots of other cards out there that just exile entire graveyards for similar mana costs, so this card's pretty useless. Trapfinder's Trick hates on a card subtype that doesn't see much play, so it mostly doesn't do anything, and it wasn't even good in its limited format, which was probably the most trap-heavy format we will ever see. These cards just do absolutely nothing in 99% of games of Magic, and that's what makes them bad. I do have them down here at number 10 because in a theoretical world where horsemanship or traps suddenly become more common, these cards would get better. Tombfire probably doesn't though, even with flashback recently becoming deciduous, because it not only hates on a thing that's very narrow, it doesn't really do a good job of it. At number 9, I have Kamals' Sledge. Unlike a lot of cards on the list, this does have the ability to impact the board, but it's so expensive for what it does that it doesn't really matter. 7 mana to do 4 damage to a creature is horrendous, and even the threshold upgrade isn't something that you're going to feel good about. If I'm paying 7 mana, I think the card should probably kill whatever I target with it, or otherwise have some big effect, and Kamals' Sledge doesn't even get close to feeling like it should cost as much as it does. Especially because it's a sorcery. You have to tap down 7 mana on your turn to use this thing, and then pass to your opponent? That's awful. At number 8, I have Rustic Siphon. So if you cast this when your opponent has no mana up, you do get to drain 5 life. That's not a bad effect, obviously, but the downside here is huge. If your opponent does have 3 mana, you end up going down a card for no effect at all. And yeah, I guess you made your opponent tap some mana, but that really isn't worth 5 mana and going down a card. The upside of the card is decent, but when the downside is that you basically hand your opponent a 3 mana counterspell when you cast it, you're talking about an absolutely awful sorcery. Some people will say with this card, well, you only cast it when your opponent doesn't have that mana available. And yeah, that's true, but that's a very narrow number of situations where you actually cast this thing, and that's what makes it awful. At number 7, it is Baki's Curse. This sorcery does 2 damage to each creature for each aura that is attached to it. Hating on creatures with auras on them has its place. After all, people love slapping a bunch of auras on a hexproof creature, but this does a terrible job of hating on that type of deck. Very rarely will this actually kill something that has a bunch of auras on it. If a creature has 1 aura on it, there's a good chance it has more than 2 toughness, and that's going to be true for every additional aura on a creature as well. In short, this is kind of a narrow card to begin with, and even when it encounters those enchanted creatures, it still doesn't really do anything. At number 6, I have bad life gain sorceries, kind of collectively, with Spring of Eternal Peace as the stand-in, because I think it's the worst of them all. Basically, a card that only gains you life is not worth it. You're usually just delaying the inevitable, and not even doing a good job of it. If you're paying 5 mana for the Spring just to gain 8 life, your opponent is almost certainly going to do something with their turn that negates the life you gained immediately, while also punishing you for not adding to the board. Even a card like Archangel's Light, which is a famously terrible mythic rare, looks incredibly strong compared to the Spring, because at least Archangel's Light has the capacity to gain you absurd amounts of life, while also saving you from milling. Spring of Eternal Peace gains you life, and nothing else. At number 5, I have Bargain, which is even worse life gain than the Spring of Eternal Peace. Not only do you use a card and a mana to do nothing but gain life, you also let your opponent draw a card. That's right, this pure life gain spell is also a 2-for-1. This is a card that's kind of funny in EDH because you can help someone else draw a card, but that sort of fun political effect usually isn't actually good, so while it's played more in EDH than some of the other cards on this list, because it can be fun in the right environment, it still barely sees play in the format. At number 4, I have Tanguard Scler. For 1 mana, this lets you reorganize the top 3 cards of your opponent's library. That effect is already not a very good one. Sure, it gives you some information and a tiny bit of control over your opponent's next few turns, but that generally isn't worth a card. However, it gets even worse than that. Your opponent also gets to do the same thing to your top 3 cards. That means you're getting even less value, and really, using this card just ends up being a wash. You and your opponent both make sure you draw the worst cards possible the next couple of turns, and that's it, and you spent a mana and a card to make it happen. Like Bargain, this does have some interesting implications in the right playgroup, where you and your opponent can sort of help each other with this, but even with that in mind, the effect you're getting out of this card won't be worth it ever. You still come out way behind in the long run since you're the one who spent the card on the effect. At number 3, it is Hint of Insanity. This makes your opponent reveal their hand and discard all non-land cards with the same name as another non-land card in their hand. Yeah, obviously that's near useless in a singleton format like Commander. I guess it could be some tech against people who play Relentless Rats and the like, but most of the time this does nothing but give you information, and that is not worth it. It isn't good in 60-card constructed formats either, the kind of formats that this was obviously designed for, as this is still very likely to whiff even in a situation where people are playing lots of 4-ofs. You really need a 3-mana discard spell to guarantee at least 1 card is going to get discarded, and this just doesn't do it, and the fact that it will do nothing the majority of the time is brutal. If you disagree with this assessment, well, I think you've probably got more than just a hint of insanity. At number 2, I have bad color hosing sorceries with Evaporate and Inquisition, the worst of the bunch. Hosing a specific color can be a powerful thing. There are lots of great cards in that category. The Elemental Blasts, the most famously. In fact, there are so many that I've done an MTG top 10 on color hosers, but a lot of color hosers aren't good. In fact, many of them are terrible, and Evaporate and Inquisition are great examples of that. Even in the ideal scenario for both of these cards, playing against a monocolor deck of the right color, these cards aren't good. Evaporate deals 1 damage to all blue and white creatures. Obviously, 1 damage isn't enough to kill many creatures in those colors, and if you really wanted to play something that would do 1 damage to all of your opponent's stuff, you can play any number of cards that do a better job, like the 1-mana Blazing Volley. It's pretty comical that it does the same thing, minus the color-specific part, and it costs 1/3 the mana. Then there's Inquisition. This is basically a bad 3-mana burn spell that only does anything against white decks. It does 1 damage to your opponent for each white card in their hand, so they need to be pretty close to monocolored and have a full grip of cards in their hand for this to even feel worth it. Keep in mind too, lands don't have colors, so they're not going to do anything. So you're going to pay 3 to do maybe 2 damage with this, and that's awful, and there's going to be plenty of times when it doesn't do anything. I think these are the 2 worst sorcery color hosers ever, and that's saying something because there's some terrible ones out there. And at number 1, I have Psychic Transfer. This 5-mana sorcery basically doesn't do anything. Seriously. Okay, it can do something. It lets you and your opponent exchange life totals. That kind of effect is generally overly situational and underpowered, but this is the absolute worst version of it we've ever seen. You and your opponent can only exchange life totals if the difference in your life totals is 5 or less. Yeah, that means that this doesn't have the upside other life total exchange cards have, where you can wait to do it until the difference between life totals is massive. Instead, the best this is going to do for you is effectively gain you 5 life and make your opponent lose 5 life. That's the absolute ceiling here, and you paid 5 mana for it at sorcery speed. No one should ever play this card in any circumstance. So, those are my picks for the worst sorceries in all of Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you like collecting the worst cards in the game, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards ever, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or a channel member. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.